Thank you so much for having me here. So this is my job market paper, Refugee Human Shelters and Lecture Outcomes. The title is a bit big, but it's mainly on the literature on the political economy of migration. Uh, so I think most of this audience probably knows that Venezuela has suffered a very serious political and economic crisis in recent years, especially after 2014. And United Nations estimate that almost 8 million of Venezuelans emigrated, most of them to neighboring countries in South America. So Brazil in that setting, which is where my research is going to come from, is now the fourth main destination in South America. Nowadays, there are 500,000 Venezuelans living in the country. And different from other countries in South America, the flow is pretty much geographically concentrated at the border with Venezuela in this very small state called Roraima. Also, Brazilian reception policy, receiving those migrants can be summarized in mainly three different points. So the first one was open border. So since the beginning of the humanitarian crisis, the Brazilian government kept the borders open. And that was the case, and it was only not the case during the pandemic, but the borders reopened after that. Then the Brazilian government also set up these shelters in the urban area, which is the main policy that I'm going to look at here to receive this population. So here I showed you two photos from one of those shelters, and they're going to be set up in this state capital, in Roraima's capital. And on top of that is going to be a very general setting in terms of the rights that the refugees have access to. So documentation is pretty straightforward, and they can access public services like education and health. And I'm going to mention other ones, access to labor market. So it's a pretty generous setting. And in United Nations, the UNHCR, also highlighted this as actually an example for other countries in the region to follow. So this policy is especially relevant that I'm looking at, especially these shelters in the urban area, given that the traditional reception policy in other developing countries, especially in Asia and Africa, where most of the refugees in the world are actually to seclude them in some camps in rural or far away from urban areas, and also pair that with some restrictions in I don't know, they cannot leave the camp, they cannot work, they cannot own property. So Brazil is like a shift or like improved version on that. And this is even especially more important considering that most of the refugees live in urban areas. So it's also important in terms of targeting. So we might be worried about that all this reception and this high exposure, given the human shelters, might lead to some political backlash, right? So when we have this big literature telling us that immigration flows are going to indeed increase and enhance voting for populist, far-right, or anti-migration candidates. And in this case, this Brazilian reception policy is just going to probably enhance those mechanisms behind this political backlash. So the shelters in urban area are going to increase even more contact between refugees, migrants, and locals. They are going to likely share public services and compete in the labor market as well. So use the local clinic, use the local schools. And there was a bullet point that I didn't put in here, but also probably this is going to affect the neighborhood's amenities, right, where those shelters were located. And in fact, when we look at the news around the elections happening in that area of the country, it looks like migration was a thing, right? So this is the 2018 election, and this is the year where shelters start to be set up. So some of those national papers said migration crisis become the main topic in Roraima's election. In Roraima's election, what really matters is Venezuela. And in the end of the day, we have that the elected governor said things like, all these NGOs that are here, they should go to Venezuela and serve these people there, preventing them from entering Brazil. So it looks like this political backlash, not surprisingly, end up at some extent happening in this setting. So my research question is, does the presence of these urban refugee shelters affect how locals vote, and especially their vote for the incumbent and for the far-right candidates? So I'm going to look at this Venezuelan refugee shelters in Roraima's capital called Boa Vista. I have 5 elections that I'm looking at. We have 3 pre-treatment ones and 2 post. The elections are going to cover governor and presidential elections. Related literature, I think the first one I kind of already mentioned, it is how the presence of immigrants affect voting outcomes. I also speaks with the literature with the impacts of refugee camps and shelters. So here we have a lot of papers, especially in Africa and Asia, that looks at whether refugee shelters are going to affect price of food or the economic activity around them. And there's not much going on in terms of politics. And the third one, I also speak with the literature on electoral accountability. So here, one of the candidates that I'm going to look at in my outcomes was the governor that was running for re-election and participated in those shelters policy. Okay, so I'm going to look at whether this literature, whether how voters perceive policy, how they associate policy with politicians, and whether or not we have this accountability effect happening. I mainly already talked a little bit about the contributions, but to summarize, looking at this urban shelter, I think for public policy is super relevant, as I mentioned before, especially in this new hosting developing region that is South America. I have some information on the voters' demographics, so I can explore a little bit of who is the demographics that is changing their voting, which is something that most papers in this literature, at least in the first literature here, don't look at very much. And also I can look at this culture and integration mechanism that I'm going to explain in the end by looking at different ethnicities of those Venezuelans. So I already said this, but the Venezuelans, they were crossing the border and going to the state capital here, especially after 2016. The state capital, Boa Vista. As I mentioned, it was a pretty generous setting, so they can, once they arrive, freedom of movement within the country, they can go anywhere they want. They can access the national health system, public education, formal labor market, and the welfare programs. The last two, once they regularize it, we don't have a regularization rate, an official one, but using some estimates is pretty much close to 100%. You can get your regularizer just by applying through your phone and going to a very quick interview in an office building. Yeah. So the city ran a survey in 2018. So the shelters were set up in beginning of 2018. By June 2018, the city did the survey, and it found out that 7 or almost 8% of its population was refugees. And there were 11 shelters, and they were hosting 5,000 Venezuelans by October 2018 when the election happened. Okay. So now that I talk a bit about the migration side, let me talk about the politics side. So voting in Brazil, just a very quick summary, is mandatory for everyone between 18 and 65 years old. Immigrants cannot vote without a citizenship, so only citizens can do. And to get a citizenship is a process of living in the country, proving proficiency of Portuguese. So basically immigrants, in this case, Venezuelans, they are not voting. It's just the Brazilians voting here. In terms of voting logistics, you're always going to be assigned to a building where you're going to vote. And actually in that building, there's going to be different rooms where you can vote. And according to the Brazilian electoral code, you're going to be every year voting in the same building, in the same room. So there is some inertia once you're allocated to that building, to that room. And on top of that, the building is going to be close to where you live. So there is some association between where you vote or you live. Here we don't have those voting districts, right, which is common in other settings. I think in Europe and the US might be more common, but it's just it kind of behaves like a voting district. Just a summary of the candidates that I'm looking at. So at the president side, we have two ones. So in 2018, Bolsonaro was running for re-election, a famous far-right populist candidate. He ended up winning that election. And then we have his opinion about refugees that are coming to Brazil. And then the Workers' Party, the main opponent, the name of the candidate was Haddad. And in his program, he mentioned that the government will promote the rights of immigrants through national migration policy and broadly recognize the rights of refugees. So we have like different approaches and different views of migration here. There are other presidential candidates, but I'm not going to be looking at them. Just a spoiler, mainly all the dynamics here are happening between those two candidates. And for governor, we have the incumbent that I mentioned. She was running for re-election. and the state government during her time there participated in the reception policy by providing the land and the buildings and also managing some shelters. And the other candidate was supported by Bolsonaro, so they kind of run together, right? He is a president and this guy Denarium as governor. And besides the first quote that I showed you before, here we have another one. Together, refugees, drug dealers, and criminals are entering one country. Venezuela does not fit inside Roraima. So the data that I will be looking at, the political outcomes come from the Superior Electoral Court, where we have the results of the elections at the room level, right? And I also have the characteristics of the registered voters also at the room level. So I have the age, the sex, and education of them. For the shelters data, I use United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees reports, where I have the location of the shelters, when they open, when they close, their capacity, number of people living there, and some socioeconomic and demographic characteristics of the Venezuelans living there as well. I also use other data. This Hidalgo is a professor from AIT, has this public available data on the latitude and longitude of polling stations. I also use public schools data. So we have this annual census that I covered until 2023 that has number of kids in schools, their nationality, and other school information. And I haven't yet, I cleaned this data, but I haven't yet explored. I have crime data at the date, so I have the date of the crime, the street that it happened, the neighborhood, and the type that covers 2014, 2022. So here's a map that summarizes where the shelters are, these red stars, and where the other polling stations are. We have around 150 polling stations. And here, for example, is an example of one polling station, just so you can know what my data looks like. So this polling station is in elementary school, and it has 3 rooms, A, B, and C, for example, here, and we have information in each one of those rooms. So I know the result of the election in that room, but I also know that there were 279 registered voters, 46 of them were less than 25 years old, 57 college degree, 122 men, and I also can do the combination of those. So I know the number of men less than 25 years old with college degree, for example. So probably you already guessed that I am gonna go for a definitive empirical strategy. Here's just a two-way fixed effect specification. So I have the outcome at the room I that is located in a polling station or a building J for election that happened in year T. I have 2 versions, one with a continuous and one with a dummy treatment. So for the continuous, I just have 1 over the distance of that polling station J into the closest shelter. And the treated is just a dummy if that polling station is less than 1 kilometer away from one of those shelters. So here I have the time fixed effects and room fixed effect. Clustered the errors are clustered at the polling station level. Just so here on the dummy, actually, you can do the dummy in different for different values. So for example, 500 meters, 1 kilometer, 1 kilometer, 1.5 kilometers is not gonna make much of a difference. 1 kilometer is exactly a percentile 33%. So it makes exactly 1/3 of the polling stations treated. On top of that, I can add in some specifications, I'm going to add some controls. We know that adding controls, even though this is a very simple diff and diff with no staggering design, it's pretty straightforward, but it's still recommended that we run this doubly robust diff and diff or matching diff and diff if we add controls. So I'm going to do that as well. And the controls that I'm adding first is a geographic one that is used by others, Cuban papers like this one, Henning 2001. That is just the distance of that polling station to downtown times multiplied by time dummies. So it's just to figure out different dynamics happening between, I don't know, suburban areas of the city, for example. To be fair, adding those geographic or not, adding or not those geographic controls is not going to make much of a difference for the results. And on top of that, I can also add demographic, which are those characteristics that I mentioned to you. So all those interactions between education, age, and gender, which is going to be given the data that I have, around 23 variables that I can add to control for the voters' characteristics. if I use these demographics, just in mind, I only have 3 elections because they were only available after 2014. So I lose 2 pre-treatment elections once I include these demographics. So in the end, my panel is going to have 238 balanced rooms. So I'm going to follow 238 of those rooms. As I mentioned, a third of them are treated. So they're close, less than 1 kilometer away from one of the shelters. And on average, they have 326 voters. Now the next question is, okay, let's see where first, okay, but how about the location of the shelters, right? So first, technically, this reception policy that that was called Operação Acolhida was mainly, it was a very emergency effort, very quickly implemented. So between the first month that they decided to do the shelters and when the shelters were set up is less than 2 months. And it was the militaries that were responsible for picking the available places to put the shelters. There's not much information of why exactly, what was the option of places and why they picked certain ones. So there's no data on that. Unfortunately, what I could do is just try to do a balance table between treated rooms, right, and control rooms and see if the balance table works. And spoiler, it doesn't work very well. So here we do have differences, especially in education. So in terms of age and gender, it looks like the polling stations in treated and control areas are pretty similar, but the polling stations in treated areas, they are less educated. So higher share of illiterate people, higher share of people with less than high school, which goes in this direction of maybe they are putting those shelters in places in neighborhoods that are poorer, right, where we have less educated voters. And of course, this difference in education is also going to lead to some differences in pre-migration political preferences. So those places are also higher supporters of the government, of the incumbent governor, and also higher supporters of the Workers' Party for president. So it's a little bit counterintuitive, right? Because at least the governor that was participating in the policy, the shelters were placed in neighborhoods that supported her more once in the election that she was elected. But here, so we don't have much of a quasi-exogenous location. So I'm going to tackle this by doing an event study of those 1 and 2 equations that I showed before to see if at least we have pre-trends, right? So the diff technically is going to deal with all those level differences, and I'm going to show you the event study showing that actually we don't have many pre-trends happening. And all those variables that are here in this table, I didn't show all of them. They are also added as a control in specification 1 and 2. So jumping to the results, actually, these are not the main results of the paper, so I'm gonna kind of go a little bit fast. So we have here the different equations 1 and 2, dummy and continuous treatment. And for the governor, the incumbent, we can see that most of the specifications, we have this negative effect in 2018, once the shelters were put in place and she was running for re-election. So it looks like people living close to the shelters punished her. And if we do that for the other candidate, the governor candidate supported by Bolsonaro, the presidential far-right candidate, we see the opposite effect with similar magnitude. So she was losing around 3 to 4 percentage points in treated rooms, treated polling stations, and this is actually translated into an increase of support for this far-right candidate. Unfortunately, I cannot have pre-trends for this far-right because in 2010, 2006, the party of this candidate here was not participating in the elections and was not supporting anyone in 2006 and 2010 elections. I do have 2014, which is my baseline, but there is some suggested evidence that then people punish her and move to the right, which goes in the direction of the literature as well. When we look at other, I'm going to just summarize the others because it's too many graphs, but the other elections we have, president election, there was no incumbent running for president election, so the president decided to not run for re-election back then. But we do see similar effects for Bolsonaro, actually around similar magnitudes of like 3 to 4 percentage points, 2 to 4 percentage points in the second round. And also this comes at the punishment or decrease of support, I think it's better, of the Workers' Party in the second round. Interesting enough, this effect persisted in 2022. So we do see this going on in 2022 election. There is no effect on turnout, so people that shows up to vote, and no effect on the non-valid votes, right? So people voting for, I don't know, no candidate or just leaving the ballot blank or something like that. I also look at state and national Congress, and I also don't observe any effects on those elections. So everything is mainly concentrated in this executive power of governor and president. Okay, so now that we found out those political effects, I'm gonna go on trying to figure out what's the demographics that are leading those effects. So for that, what I'm gonna do, just take the first specification, the dummy one, and interact that with some characteristic that summarizes one of those three dimensions, gender, age, or education of the voters in that room I. So this ZIJT is just going to be either the share of male in that room I, or the share of people that are young, less than 30 years old, or the share of people that are low educated, less than high school. Okay, so it's basically I'm going to run one regression for each one of those three summarizing demographics. So for right now, we found that the governor election, the incumbency, the accountability effect is coming from basically sessions or rooms that has larger share of male or low educated or younger voters. Okay, so it looks like this is the demographic that is behind that incumbent effect. I think it's interesting that gender shows up here. So male is not a thing that we see as a traditional effect in presidential election, but we do see here. And I think it's important to remind that the incumbent candidate was a woman. She was running for re-election, and maybe there is something also related with this gender preferences going on here. President election, we saw increased support for far right, and this in the president election we don't see much of heterogeneous effect in those dimensions. If anything, there is some suggestive evidence of low educated voters. So it looks like the presidential election was more affecting the average voter, let me put that way, right, than just some specific type of demographics. And this could also be one of the reasons why in the president election, we see the effects lasting until 2022 too as well, right, lasting to more also in the following election. So what I'm going to do next is figure out any potential alternative stories that we can use to explain these results that are not coming from the shelters. So the first one that we can think of is some composition effect. So maybe the voters are going to move within the city. So I'm going to change to another neighborhood, and therefore I'm going to be assigned to another polling station because I don't like the shelters and I don't like the immigrants. So this could lead to some endogenous reacting of the voters to the shelters, or it could be also the assignment of voters. I don't know, the institution responsible for election are going to place specific voters in certain areas. So in terms of the endogenous moving within the city, this is, at least for the 2018 election, unlikely to happen because they have a very small time window to change their polling station in case they move to another neighborhood. So they had, for example, until May 9, 2018 to change polling stations, and the shelters were open after March. Most of them were open after March. So they have like less than 2 months to rent a new place or buy a new place, get a residence proof, go to the office and change their polling station based on their new residency. But just to make things a little bit more formal, what I can do is I can use the voters' characteristics as outcomes in my specifications 1 and 2. So here I'm going to have a multiple regressions, each one for their voter characteristics in that room. So this is a share of men, the same 23 different variables that I put there. This is only a selection of them, but as you can see, there is not much going on in terms of those demographics. So it doesn't look like there is any composition effect, at least in those age, gender, and education and their interactions. Then a second alternative story that we can think is that maybe they made the voting harder in certain polling stations because of the shelters or things like that. So they changed the logistics of the election. Our turnout and the share of non-valid votes, especially the turnout, given that there was no effect, maybe it's already an indication that there was not much going on here, but I did the same strategy. And instead of using the voters characteristic as outcome, I use some election logistic characteristics or variables as outcome. So for example, here, I have the number of rooms in a certain polling station, the number of registered voters in that polling station, the average size of a room, the size of the biggest room, the size of the smallest room, the number of rooms that were not operating that year that were operating the year before, so the non-balanced ones. And also, again, there is not much going on. Also, the number of registered voters in that section, also if the section was operating or not in that year. So it doesn't look like logistic was something that was manipulated by the way that the election was set up because of the shelter. Right? Okay. Then I move now to what I believe is one of the main results of the paper, which is the mechanism. And for that, I'm going to exploit the characteristics of the shelter. So let me see. We have different types of shelters. And the most striking characteristic between them is the ethnicity of the Venezuelan refugee population that they host. So here we have indigenous and non-indigenous shelters, and among the 11 shelters, 2 were hosting exclusively Venezuelan indigenous population. So according to the IOM, the indigenous Venezuelan population, of course, was leaving Venezuela because of the economic and political crisis, but there are also some climate change push factors to the region that they used to leave. Here we have ethnicity. The main ethnicity was Warao. There is no previous history of them in the Brazilian territory before. They moved after with this flow, right? And also there is, I mean, Warao is the main one, and according to the IOM is more than 60, 70% of them, but there is also other 13 ethnicities of indigenous Venezuelans migrating. So the government mainly decided to set up those 2 shelters specifically for them because some of specific needs that they have. So for example, I think that culturally the most striking difference is the fact that for most of these ethnicities, Spanish is not even the primary language. And for example, they are used to cook with fire, right? So you have to set up some area where they can do the cooking and things like that. So that's why also this need for maybe translators. That's why the government decided to have those infrastructures just for them. Of course, I'm going to explore the fact if there is any differential effect, but I'm just want to describe a little bit those 2 populations and their difference. So exploiting here the United Nations reports for those shelters in October 2018, the month of the election, the indigenous shelters were hosting 1,200 people, the non-indigenous around 2,600. The capacity was a bit higher in the indigenous shelter, but to be fair, after the couple of months of that, both of them converged to 100%, and the shelters are always super full at 100% all the time that they are operating. In terms of gender, they are pretty similar, but when it comes to other demographics, such as schooling, you can see that they are going to be less educated, right? So we are going to have higher shares of literacy, higher shares of less than high school, very low shares of some college, right? And also in terms of age, they are younger. So we have a higher share of children and teenagers as well. Okay. So of course, that it's not surprising that this cultural ethnicity difference is going to come also be translated into differences in socioeconomic characteristics. But also we do see, again, not surprisingly, that some measures of integration. So for example, their vaccination rates are lower. If they had a social security number, so everyone has the right to have a social security number, right? You just have to go through the bureaucratic process of getting one. Also, the share of people that has one is lower. The share of people that has a work permit, again, everyone can have a work permit. It's just a matter of you accessing it through the bureaucracy, also lower among them. Here, I don't have a school enrollment, unfortunately, in those reports. So what I did was to use the school census that I mentioned in the beginning. So here I just did an event study to see what was going on with the schools close to the non-indigenous shelters and the schools close to the indigenous shelters. So the schools close to the non-indigenous shelters are going to have a surge of share of Venezuelan students among them. So actually the second year here is 2018. So by 2018, they're already something like they have 4 percentage points more Venezuelan refugees than schools further away from those shelters, but nothing's going on with indigenous shelters, right? So again, this is another anecdotal evidence that there is some lack of integration, some gap of integration. And here in schools also, it is lack of maybe contact with Brazilians as well, right? We have less Venezuelans in schools around the indigenous shelters, which is also going to induce this less contact with them somehow in the shared public service. So what I do next, let me run a diff and diff, the same specifications, but separating the treatment into whether or not that polling station is close 1 kilometer away from an indigenous shelter and whether or not it's close to a non-indigenous shelter. Okay, here's just a map, and those in yellow are the indigenous shelters. And the results leads to, I didn't put event study here just because it's going to be too much, but believe me, they are okay for both of them. Here's just the summary of the results. So basically, the indigenous shelters are the ones driving the effects of punishment in the governor. Nothing much is going on with the non-indigenous shelter across different specifications. And of course, this is also going to be connected with punish the governor, and I'm translating her votes to the far right. So also the indigenous shelters are the one pushing for this far right enhanced performance. Let me put that way. When we look at the Workers' Party, which is the second round for the presidential election, also that we saw before negative effects, also those negative effects are coming from indigenous shelters. I mean, there is not much going on, at least not consistent across different specifications for the non-indigenous shelters. Okay. So the final thing that I did for the paper is run some robustness checks. So yeah, I already run out some of those alternative stories, but I wanted to confirm the specifications in different ways. So instead of using a balanced panel of rooms, I use an unbalanced panel of rooms. Those results still there. I use other units of observation. So maybe you don't like the room level. You want me to aggregate everything at the polling station level. That stay the same. Maybe you want me to construct some type of fake voting districts, right? Some areas, and for that I use the Voronoi polygon. So we're going to construct areas of the city where people in that area are likely voting to a certain polling station or not. And the results when you do that at this voting, at this polygon level is also the same. I also keep only the likely not treated controls. So you might be afraid that, I mean, the dummy 1 kilometer is too, you should compare the ones that are close to the ones that are very further away from the shelters. I did that as well. So I keep just the ones within 1 kilometer as treated, and the other, the top 1/3 percentile of the distance as control. I also weighted the regressions by the number of registered voters, and also the result seems to be okay and robust to that. And I also standard the errors, instead of using the polling station level, I also use the neighborhood level. And also the results still statistically significant in most of the specifications. So just to summarize here, we do see from these urban shelters an accountability effect combined with this political backlash effect. There is not much going on in turnout and non-valid votes. The demographics behind that seems, especially in the accountability side of it, coming from this male, younger, and low-educated voters. And these indigenous shelters are the ones that are driving the results. So I think that one of the conclusions that I drive so far from this mechanism is that the establishment of urban refugee shelters itself might be less important than the cultural and integration features of the people that they are hosting to explain political backlash, right? Unfortunately, as I mentioned to you, this ethnicity difference, as expected, is going to come with not only a difference in culture, but also a difference in integration and also vulnerability in different dimensions of socioeconomic characteristics. So it's not possible to disentangle exactly if this is a cultural clash kind of mechanism, or is just this lack of integration, and then this poverty is very much to your face when you cross the street and see those shelters. And it's something that when I went there and talked with people was something that they mentioned a lot to me on how the city never saw homeless people before, and then suddenly you put a shelter of these extremely vulnerable people, and now you have this poverty kind of like to your face. So this could also come from that. As I mentioned, the results are robust to different specifications. And interestingly enough, all these results that I mentioned was around 2 to 4 percentage points, both in the governor and presidential election. They wouldn't change who would be elected. So the people that end up winning, so the governor that end up winning, the winning margin was way higher than 4 percentage points. So the absence of the shelter would not change who end up being elected. My next steps are to look at other elections. So we have mayor and city hall elections that they happen in a different time, years after this general election that I used. So I plan to explore those ones. As I mentioned to you, I have data on crime, so I can also look at crime as a potential mechanisms. And I think that's it. Probably I finished a little bit early, but that's great because I am excited to hear if you have any other ideas or comments, and also to hear the discussion. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Carlos. Great presentation. We now have a discussion from Dana. So Dana, share your screen and you have 10 minutes. And then after that, Carlos will give you a little bit of time if you want to respond to a couple of the points, whichever ones you want, following which we'll open the floor to everyone else. So anyone, any of the attendees on Zoom or any of the panelists, if you have questions, we can go through that next. So let's start with Dana.
All right. So this was great. Thanks, Carlos. So I'm going to discuss refugee urban shelters. Refugee urban shelters, locals, electoral outcomes, evidence from Venezuelan refugee crisis in northern Brazil. So to summarize the paper, this paper asks how exposure to Venezuelan refugees impacts voting behavior of Brazilians in Roraima, which is in northern Brazil. Carlos uses a plausibly exogenous construction of emergency shelters in the capital to identify treated voting districts or sections, which are near these shelters, and then the control districts that are similar in basically every way, but they're farther from the shelters. This enables Carlos to use a difference in different strategy and finds that left party candidates fall in the election results. At the same time, we see a rise in right party candidates for both the gubernatorial and national election. In the case of the local elections, support for the incumbent, who is of the left party, falls, but the national election had no incumbent. That being said, it was a left-leaning party that was in office broadly, so there's some of that. Carlos also finds that these results are largely concentrated in the districts or the sections that were closest to indigenous Venezuelan refugees as opposed to non-indigenous refugees. I thought it had a really clean identification strategy, right? We're all very familiar with the very rapid changes in the difference in differences space. And this is one of the cleanest opportunities to use the strategy, especially the quasi-random-ish construction of the shelters. It was also really clear the research question and how you were studying it, how you plan to interpret your results, especially for someone with very little knowledge of the Brazilian context in general. For minor points, so this was figure 17 from your paper. I don't think this made it to the presentation. And I just had one question about the labeling. Challenger to me sounds like it's always the non-incumbent, but I think it was always Bolsonaro actually, because Bolsonaro won in 2018, therefore he would be the incumbent in 2022. So I think this graph is showing just Bolsonaro support. I couldn't tell if it was showing always Bolsonaro or if it was always about the challenger. And so the reason that that kind of mattered was you can't entirely disentangle these two questions of, is this a move to the right or are they punishing any incumbent? And it just so happens that the left party was the incumbent in both cases. So one thing I would say is if I was to poke at the randomness of the voting sections and the construction of the shelters, I'm wondering if you could run a placebo test testing whether the treated districts disproportionately vote against any incumbent. Like, are these just more reactive districts in general versus, they're normal districts, they're just like the other ones, and they only voted against the incumbent because they were close to the shelters in 2018. Just to another way to get at those parallel pre-trends prior to the shelter construction. Another small point, this is going to come full circle, hopefully, but there's this paper in Demography from 2020 that shows that in the United States, attitudes about immigrants can improve when people are provided with information about immigrants. Like, they basically have this idea in their head about what an immigrant is, and then when these myths are broken for them, they actually do show more tolerance towards these immigrants. And so one thing I'm wondering is if exposure to refugees would teach Brazilians about the refugees, ultimately improving acceptance. Because you have such little time between when the shelters are constructed in 2018 and the election, right? It's not super surprising that there'd be this immediate backlash, this immediate fear. By 2022, it looked like in the local election, in the governor's election, it looked like support for Denarium had fallen. So this seems like it was relatively short-lived. So I'm wondering if there's any evidence long-term that exposure actually improves understanding. Which relates to my two kind of big picture questions. So with difference and difference, we want parallel pre-trends, and like you acknowledge in the balance table, the treated districts do seem kind of younger and less educated. With your data being spaced 4 years apart, if I was to be picky, I would say that a lot can happen between 2014 and 2018. And so that these districts may have been moving towards the right at a disproportionate rate in the interim period when you don't have data. So then I'm wondering about, if you try to really convince the readers about those parallel pre-trends, if there's poll data. I think once you add the 2016, 2018, the kind of local elections, that will help because you'll just have more years on both sides. But if there was poll data, I really liked in your paper you mentioned using the newspaper reports and headlines. There was no evidence of lobbying. So similarly, if a newspaper headline search, was there any acknowledgement of growing right-wing sentiments in certain neighborhoods of Roraima prior to 2018, just to kind of solidify for the reader that these really were on a parallel pre-trend even between 2014 and 2018? I assume you can't look at female votes only. I think you have demographic data at the district level, but I don't think, okay. I was gonna say that would just be cool because women moving to the right is pretty unusual, but yeah. And so then to kind of come back full circle to my point about this other paper in Demography, one of the things that was interesting to me was that Lula did win nationally in 2022, and it looked like in the governor's election that the votes for Denarium had fallen off. There was no longer that distance come 2022. And so if you were looking for more high frequency pre-period data, or as you bring in the city and local election data that's in those mid years, could you actually show a really interesting story of basically Brazilians kind of learning about refugees and becoming tolerant of refugees and looking at kind of the evolution of that behavior for a conclusion that supporting immigration might only hurt candidates if the election is really soon, versus if the election's 4 years from now, I bring in immigrants now, I take the backlash now, over time, my voters will learn, immigrants are valuable members of our community, and that'll actually help me as a candidate in a couple of years. Just because if you were already looking for more high frequency data, you might as well also show the reverse, because I think you'd be bridging two really interesting literatures. Thanks.
Thank you so much for that discussion. Carlos, would you like to respond to any of the points?
Sure. Thank you so much, Dana. That was very helpful. So just to answer some of your questions, the challenger graph. So it's always the candidate that is challenging in the second round. So always the Workers' Party is always in the second round. So it's always going to be another party on the other side. It happens to be Bolsonaro in 2018, 2022, as you mentioned. For the other years, I use other candidates. They are coming from different political spectrum, and it's usually like a right or center right.
So it's
candidate.
challenger
Great point.
of the working party.
Yes, exactly.
Not challenger of the, okay.
Then the second point about the elections on Denarium. So the way that I saw the effect fading away when Denarium was running for re-election, it's almost like also this accountability kind of story, in the sense that, okay, you didn't like this candidate that put the shelters, you vote for this other one, and then he enters and their shelters are still there. So this kind of like, okay, I'm not gonna vote for him anymore. So that's the way I interpret this so far. And yeah, I do plan to combine the local elections and the general elections, so we can have like every 2 years kind of observation to see this pattern. I agree, 4 and 4 years maybe too much to claim anything going on in terms of the parallel trends. But yeah, I agree with all your comments. Thank you so much. That was very helpful.
Great. There was one question in the Q&A, so it's pretty similar to this line of questioning that Dana brought up, but in case there's more nuance to the question, I'm going to unmute the participant in the chat.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Carlos, for sharing this study. Super interesting. And as somebody who's followed Venezuelan migration to Brazil, and in particular to Roraima, for a while now, this was a really interesting paper to me. So thank you again for sharing it. My question pretty closely follows what was already discussed, and you kind of gave a little bit of your answer as is, but I was curious to hear a little bit more about your thoughts on the decrease in the effect for Denarium between 2018 and 2022. And part of the reason why I ask is because I also wonder if, to what degree the support for Denarium may have been related to Bolsonaro and riding Bolsonaro's coattails, as opposed to kind of the anti-immigration attitudes. And so obviously there's the change in incumbency and that having an effect, but also, Bolsonaro as an incumbent as well, and as a kind of sponsor of a candidate. Obviously, he was a lot less popular in 2022 in comparison to 4 years prior. So I'm curious to hear a little bit more about your thoughts on that. But thanks again.
Thank you for your comment. Yeah, so that's a great point. So in 2018 election, when both of them were first elected, they were very close to each other, and Bolsonaro traveled to the state and they did some like events together and things like that. And I haven't looked exactly what happened in 2022 election, if that connection was still close. What I know that is interesting is that both of them changed parties by 2022, and they were in different parties by 2022. So their connection was not quite there anymore. So that's a very interesting point that I hadn't fully realized. So that's interesting. So I do observe them in photos together in 2018. I do have to see exactly how was this political environment in 2022. One thing that also I didn't mention much in the presentation is that I don't want to picture the incumbent governor as this very pro-migration progressive candidate, because even though she participated in these policies, she was trying to like picture this anti-migration image by the time of the election. So she was trying to convince the government to close the border and things like that. So just sorry, I should have mentioned that in the presentation, but I don't want you to think that she was super progressive and super pro-migration. All the candidates in that governor election was trying to show themselves as anti-migration, especially with this proposal of closing the borders. But yeah, thank you for your comment.
Great, thank you. Are there any other questions? Yeah, Tula.
Hello. Very interesting presentation, Carlos. I have a couple of minor comments. First, I wanted to ask you how is possible how exactly do you identify refugees in your data? in order not to confuse them with economic migrants. Because you were telling us at the beginning that when refugees arrive, they have a lot of rights and they can perfectly work, no? So, well, that's the first question.
Okay, yeah, we don't, in the data in the UNHCR reports that I use, there is no documentation separating who got, let me say, a Brazilian green card or a residency, which you might think this is more of like an economic migrant, and who got the asylum seeker request, right? And who is asking for a refugee. The way that I interpret this and the way that I use the refugees is because it's the way that the UNHCR was describing the setting back then, and also is the UNHCR that was behind the shelters management. And also because there are some other papers, there are mainly in law that check that people accessing either the refugee or the Brazilian residency was a matter of just the availability of documents, was not necessarily something intrinsic about the reason why they move out of Venezuela. So even those differential types of access to documents, if you get a residency or if you get a refugee status, that they don't tell us in this specific setting by the way that Brazilian migration law works or the way that they were treating refugees, Venezuelan refugees back then, then don't able us to fully disentangle the reasons behind that. So I'm using refugee, and maybe I should be using more like forcibly displaced. It might be a more friendly word on this, but I use that mainly because it was the way that the UNHCR was describing this flow back then in 2018.
Okay, fair enough. And second question I wanted to ask you is how different are the governors and presidential elections? So let me explain. In Spain, we know that so the equivalent to governor elections here in Spain will be to vote for the regions, you know, for the 17 different communities within Spain. And we know that people vote very different in these community elections than in the presidential elections. And yet, in your paper, you are using both elections, the governor's one and the presidential ones, for your results. So I wanted to ask, I guess that if you are doing this because probably there's not that much difference, but I actually wanted you to tell me a little bit more about this and why you pull both type of elections together.
Thank you, that's great. So I decided to do both of them because the president and the governor has very different powers when it comes to migration policy. So for example, if you are worried about the migration flow when you want the state to close its border, only the president can do that. The governor cannot do that. For example, if you're worried about you're giving those people too many rights, there's too many documentation, they should have access to those. Only the president can do that. So the president is the one responsible for migration law in general. That's very little that the governor can do in terms of migration law or migration policy directly to them. As a governor, what you can do more or less is like, okay, I'm not gonna build an extra school to host this population. This is like the furthest that you can go. It's more like ignoring the flow than acknowledging it and integrating them in those dimensions that I mentioned. So that was one of the first reasons that I decided to separate between them, because if you want the Venezuelans to go away, kind of like the governor cannot close the border, the governor can. So yeah. But yeah, in the end, I'm not sure about different voting behaviors in those elections. What I know is that Roraima is a state that, compared to that region in Brazil, Northern Amazon region, it is a state that is more to the right of the other ones. So it was always a state that kind of had this right-leaning governors. It was like usual for them to do so, and they always like also usually go to the right in terms of the presidential election. So they are kind of paired in that sense.
Okay, thank you.
I think there was a question by one of the attendees raised their hands. Okay. Maybe not anymore. I'll have a question for you on clarification. So Is in order to regularize in Brazil, do you need a Venezuelan national document, an ID card, or can you regularize without that? Because I'm Venezuelan, so I know it's pretty much of a problem to get an ID card. So
Yeah, my understanding is that if you want to apply for the residency, so there is agreements between Brazil and basically all the South American countries. So getting residency is, I don't want to say straightforward, but there is a path to that where you don't need like someone hiring you from Brazil. You can do that by filling out some documents, and you have to bring your birth certificate and things like that. The asylum request is way much more lenient on that, exactly because he recognized that this population is running and moving away from a situation where they either lost their documents throughout the process of ending up in the host country, or because the government was not capable of issuing those documents in the beginning with, or not willing to issue those documents because of political reasons. So the asylum request basically virtually request no document at all, or a very limited number of documents. So, and as I mentioned to you, the path to ask for refugee status is you go to this website, you fill out a form, and then the form is going to ask you to schedule an appointment in one of those offices where you bring whatever you have. And once, at the moment that you press send in this form online, you're already documented. So they're already going to give you a number, and with that number, you can get a social security number and a worker's permit.
okay.
Can I ask a question? One thing I was wondering about is you said that a lot of the shelters were at like full capacity, like close to 100%. So did that mean that there were other refugees who weren't placed in the shelter and maybe in like surrounding areas? So I'm wondering if like some of the shelters also attracted refugees outside of the shelter, or if they settled in non-shelter related areas as well.
Yeah, thank you for your question. Yes, so because it was 100% capacity, there is always a line outside the shelter waiting to get inside. So basically, when a family leave, and here I didn't mention this, but there was the displacement policy. So the government was giving flight tickets and bus tickets for these people to go to other parts of Brazil. And for that, you have to be basically in the shelter. So the families in the shelters were like, there was like a movement, right? People leaving and then people entering. So there was a population around the shelters waiting to get inside. Unfortunately, the data on other, and let me put like informal housing or slums or things like that around the city, that data kind of doesn't exist, or I couldn't access it yet. I didn't find anything related with that yet. But one thing that I know is that indeed the shelters are going to induce some type of homeless population around it. So yeah, thank you.
I have a question about the settlement patterns of the earlier Venezuelan waves of migrants that you mentioned. So like these higher education, kind of wealthier immigrants who left first. Do you know anything about where they might have settled in Roraima and in the capital? And if there was like any introduction or kind of desensitization of certain populations in the capital to these earlier Venezuelan migrants?
Yeah, so right after the beginning of the crisis there, when those people that you mentioned, the ones that has more sources and more highly educated moved, usually they are not going to end up in that state at all. They're just going to fly directly to like the main urban centers of the country. So just to picture, Roraima is the smallest Brazilian state in terms of population and in terms of GDP. So it was a state that was, I don't know, coincidentally enough, in the border, let me put that way. But yeah, so this business goal there. And actually, this is one of the critiques, like one of the part of the speech, right? So besides Roraima receiving Venezuela, it's receiving a certain type of Venezuelan, right? And this is like we're receiving the worst Venezuelan. So this is also enhancing, it's in the speech of people, yeah.